Harriet Albright had lived in the tall, white Victorian house on Sycamore Street for more than 70 years. She had moved in at age 19, newly married, and the house became the anchor of her life's journey. Now at 90, she was a widow, a retired high school English teacher, and the last original homeowner on the block. Rising property taxes and shifting city policies had forced nearly everyone else out over the years. New condominiums and commercial buildings sprouted up around her once peaceful neighborhood like weeds. Yet Harriet refused to leave. Every inch of her home held a memory, from the echoes of her husband's laughter in the living room to the pencil marks on a door frame where she had measured her daughter's growth each year. Despite the changes around her, Harriet's morning rituals remained the same. At 7 o'clock sharp, she rose from her antique four-poster bed, shuffled into her kitchen, and warmed a pot of water for tea. She didn't fuss with coffee or fancy lattes. A simple cup of Earl Grey with a touch of honey was all she needed. While waiting for the kettle to whistle, she'd flip through the local paper, stubbornly refusing to read the news on a tablet like her neighbors, and cluck her tongue at the headlines of the day. On this particular morning, Harriet's heart lurched as she saw a bold headline on page 3. City's redevelopment plan targets historic properties for demolition. The attached photograph showed a city official standing in front of a row of older houses, presumably like hers, explaining how outdated structures hindered the town's modernization. The mention of eminent domain made her shiver. Harriet had heard rumors that the city council, spurred on by unscrupulous developers, wanted to transform every last remaining historical home into sleek apartment towers and shopping complexes. She had worried about the day they might turn their eyes to her beloved Victorian. Now that day seemed dangerously close. She read through the article in full and discovered her suspicions confirmed. A large-scale redevelopment initiative threatened to sweep through Sycamore Street. The city touted new jobs and increased tax revenue, but Harriet saw only the heartbreak of families forced from their homes. In her small-scale activism over the years, writing letters, attending town hall meetings, she'd come to understand how determined the city powers could be. After all, money and political ambition had driven out most of her old neighbors. The kettle began to whistle, drawing Harriet back to the present. She moved from her worn, cozy armchair to the stove. She tried to calm her racing thoughts. In her decades of life, Harriet had learned that fear rarely solved anything. Instead, she took a breath and wondered whether she should once again call her daughter, Natalie, to discuss the rising tensions in the city council. Natalie. Even the sound of her name brought a surge of pride. Harriet's only child had joined the CIA right after college, a path that had taken Harriet and her late husband by surprise. Natalie's brilliant mind had made her an invaluable asset in analyzing complicated international threats. Over the years, Harriet had heard only fragments of her daughter's missions, but each fragment had been enough to make Harriet's heart pound with concern and pride. Still, mother and daughter saw each other rarely. Natalie was almost always on some secret assignment, often halfway around the world. Calls were sporadic but heartfelt. Harriet could tell her daughter longed for a more normal relationship, yet global crises seldom allowed it. The last Harriet heard, Natalie had left the agency to pursue a quieter life, but Harriet had no details. They hadn't spoken in 3 months. Harriet carefully poured her steaming tea and settled in at the dining room table. Bright sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating the small bouquet of fresh daisies she kept by the salt shaker. The house was old, yes, but it was beautiful. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, cause tomorrow's story is going to be mind-blowing. Dust motes floated in the light, and Harriet gazed around at the well-loved furniture, the neatly kept floors, the memories etched into every corner. She felt an ache, not for her own sake, but for the history these walls contained. Where would she go if the city forced her out? A cramped retirement facility? A cold apartment building? No. Harriet had taught Shakespeare to thousands of teenagers for over 40 years. She guided entire generations through Hamlet and Macbeth. She had a quiet resolve about her, a backbone forged by a lifetime of patience and perseverance. She would not give in easily. A sudden knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. It was only 8 in the morning, earlier than she usually received visitors. She set down her tea, smoothed back her gray hair, and ambled to the door, careful not to rush lest she slip on the wooden floor. When she opened the door, she found a young man in a tailored suit, carrying a clipboard. His face was impassive but polite, like a bank teller. "Mrs. Albright," he said. "Good morning, ma'am. My name is Thomas Kimball. I work for the city's Planning and Redevelopment Department." Harriet felt her heart tighten. "Yes," she replied, lifting her chin. "I'd like to discuss some urgent matters about your property. May I come in?" Harriet paused. She considered refusing, but there was no point in hiding. She'd have to face this sooner or later. She stepped aside. "All right," she said. "Come in." The young man wiped his shoes on the mat and followed Harriet into the living room. He cast a disapproving glance at the worn wallpaper and old-fashioned decor, as if the place were more museum than home. Sitting on the edge of Harriet's couch, he opened his clipboard, revealing official-looking documents stamped with city seals. "Mrs. Albright," he said in a professional monotone, "it has come to the city's attention that your property is in a designated redevelopment zone. We are offering relocation assistance for any residents displaced by this process. You will receive compensation, of course, an amount we believe is more than fair, and we'll help with arrangements should you need a new residence that meets your mobility requirements." "I don't need or want your help with new residents," Harriet said firmly. "I have a home. This is it." "Yes, well," Thomas continued, "the city's plan involves demolishing many of these older structures to make way for new housing units, restaurants, and shops. It will bring significant revenue to the area, an economic boon. Naturally, any refusal to sell will impede progress, and the city can pursue other legal avenues. Eminent domain, for instance." Harriet fixed him with a steely look. She'd spent decades taming rowdy students and defiant parents. A single bureaucrat did not intimidate her. "Young man," she said, "I've read about eminent domain, and I'm aware that it does not give the city the right to pluck me from my home without due process." Thomas cleared his throat. "There's a hearing scheduled soon. You'll receive a formal notice in the mail, but I wanted to speak with you in person. If we can come to an agreement early, it would save everyone trouble." He tapped his pen against the clipboard. "Think it over." He stood, smoothing his suit jacket. Harriet didn't offer a handshake. His eyes flicked across the living room, perhaps assessing its meager financial value compared to the commercial land the city wanted. Then he headed for the door. "Have a nice day, Mrs. Albright," he said on his way out. The door closed, and Harriet sank into her armchair, mind swirling. The city was moving faster than she'd imagined. She could handle a hearing, but she suspected there might be more behind this, something unscrupulous that would require a fight. Was she prepared? After a long moment, she reached for the phone on the small table next to her. She didn't care if it was early where Natalie lived. This was an emergency. She dialed her daughter's number, voice trembling with the sudden realization that she could no longer face this battle alone. 10 days later, Harriet found herself waiting at the front window, lace curtains pulled back just enough so she could spot any approaching car. Her daughter's flight had landed at noon. It was now 1:30 in the afternoon. Anxiety fluttered in Harriet's chest, mixed with excitement. She hadn't seen Natalie in nearly a year. Finally, a sleek black sedan turned a corner, slowing before Harriet's front gate. Harriet watched her daughter step out of the car, hair cropped short in a no-nonsense cut, wearing a stylish leather jacket and practical boots. Even from a distance, Harriet could sense the confidence in Natalie's posture. Ex-CIA indeed, Harriet thought proudly. Natalie had always carried herself as someone who had seen the world. Harriet hurried to the door before her daughter could ring the bell. The moment Harriet opened it, Natalie flashed a warm smile and closed the distance between them, embracing her mother with gentle care. "Mom," Natalie said softly, kissing Harriet's cheek. "It's good to see you." "Oh, Natalie, darling." You look so grown up." Harriet's eyes shimmered with tears. She tried to gather her composure. "I'm so glad you could make it on such short notice." Natalie stepped back and studied her mother for a moment. Harriet's silver hair was neatly pinned, and though she was small and fragile-looking, her chin was set with determination. "You sound worried on the phone," Natalie said, stepping inside. "What's going on with the city? And why are they trying to evict you?" Harriet shut the door and gestured for Natalie to follow her into the living room. The house still smelled of the tea Harriet had brewed earlier, a comforting aroma that laced the anxious atmosphere with warmth. "They're calling it redevelopment, but it's really just a land grab," Harriet explained. "They want to demolish old homes like this to build new complexes. They claim eminent domain gives them the right if I refuse to sell." Natalie inspected the living room. She noticed the new documents Harriet had stacked on the coffee table: legal papers, city council notices, and letters with official letterheads. "They can't just throw you out," Natalie said quietly, though Harriet could hear the undercurrent of controlled anger. "But I know how local officials can be. They find ways to bend the law when it suits them." Harriet handed her to the top sheet of paper. "This is a notice about a hearing next month. They say they want to discuss my options. But I've seen them do this before to neighbors, bullying them into selling under threat of losing everything." Natalie's brow furrowed as she read. Her background and intelligence had given her a sense for potential corruption. The official language on the page was all carefully worded, suggesting an air of legality. But Natalie had spent years unraveling webs of deceit spun by far more dangerous figures than small-town bureaucrats. She set the paper down and gently placed a hand on Harriet's shoulder. "Mom," she said, "you're not going anywhere you don't want to go." Harriet managed a tight smile. "I've been fighting for as long as I can, darling, but I'm afraid this might be bigger than anything I can handle alone. The city has the resources to drag this out in court. I've seen them break people over legal fees alone." Natalie gave a short nod and exhaled. "I'm not worried about the city's resources," she said. "I want to know who's behind this, who gains from forcing you out. It can't just be about a development plan. There's always a key player with personal motives." Her words reminded Harriet of the calm assurance Natalie had brought to everything she did, even as a child. When Harriet had trouble with a broken lawnmower or a lost checkbook, Natalie would step in with systematic efficiency. It seemed she'd only grown sharper and more formidable during her years in the CIA. They spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing every letter and notice Harriet had received over the past year. Natalie spotted small inconsistencies, such as contradictory dates and signatures from people Harriet had never met. She made a list of names: city council members, the mayor, the attorney from the real estate developer's office. When they finally took a break, the day had drifted into early evening. Harriet insisted on making a light supper: grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, simple comfort food that reminded Natalie of childhood. They sat at the small dining table, the overhead chandelier casting a warm glow on the worn tablecloth. "Tell me about your life after leaving the agency," Harriet said as she stirred her soup. "We barely got to talk about it on the phone." Natalie paused, taking a slow bite of her sandwich before responding. "I was ready for a more normal life," she admitted. "I've been through too many harrowing missions. I saw things, lost friends, and I didn't want to keep living like that. So I took an early exit and decided to do consulting work. Security consulting, mostly for corporations that need to protect their data." Harriet nodded, sadness flickering across her eyes. She remembered how distant Natalie seemed in those final years of CIA service, always traveling, always exhausted. "I'm glad you left that high-stress environment, dear. You deserve peace. But I'm even more glad you're here to help me." Natalie reached across the table to squeeze her mother's hand. "You were always there for me, Mom. It's my turn to be there for you." They finished dinner, cleaned up the dishes together, a rare but comforting domestic moment for both of them, and retreated back to the living room to outline a plan. Natalie had always been good at taking seemingly insurmountable problems and breaking them into steps. First, I want to find out if this is purely local or if there's a bigger corporation pulling the strings, she said, scanning her notes. The company name I keep seeing is Maze Bridge Development. I'd like to visit City Hall tomorrow, see if I can dig up anything else. Maybe talk to the neighbors, see if they've gotten similar notices. Harriet nodded. I appreciate it, but be careful. I've heard rumors that Maze Bridge has powerful friends in the city council. They strong-armed poor Mrs. Lockwood into selling last year. She got less than half her home's worth. Natalie's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not easily intimidated. You know that. They continued until the night grew late, planning strategies and discussing possible outcomes. Harriet's eyelids grew heavy. Natalie guided her mother up to bed. You need rest, Natalie insisted. Tomorrow we start uncovering the truth. Though Harriet tried to sound confident, she was relieved to have Natalie's calm, fearless presence beside her. As she drifted off to sleep, Harriet prayed that it wouldn't be too late, that the forces determined to uproot her life hadn't already set in motion something unstoppable. The next morning, Natalie rose before her mother, accustomed to an internal clock shaped by years of intelligence work. She slipped into her boots and grabbed a black blazer, preparing to visit City Hall. Before leaving, she brewed a small pot of coffee, leaving a note for Harriet on the kitchen counter, back soon. Don't worry. City Hall was an imposing building of gray stone, constructed in an era when grandeur was meant to reflect civic pride. Tall columns flanked its entrance, and at this early hour, only a few staff trickled into the lobby. Natalie spotted a security guard behind a metal detector, a bored expression on his face. She walked up to the reception desk. A middle-aged woman with horn-rimmed glasses peered at her over a computer monitor. Can I help you? She asked in a tone that suggested she was already tired of the day. Good morning, Natalie said with an easy smile. I'm looking for public records on Maze Bridge Development's acquisitions. I believe those are a matter of public record if any taxpayer money is involved. The woman adjusted her glasses and tapped at her keyboard. Those records are usually handled by the Planning and Redevelopment Department, second floor. Thank you, Natalie said, heading toward the staircase. On the second floor, she passed a series of cubicles and offices, each marked with nameplates and departmental titles. She found a small sign that read Public Records and Filings. The door was open, revealing rows of filing cabinets, a pair of computers, and a young clerk stacking manila folders. Hi there, Natalie said, stepping in. I need access to certain contracts and proposals involving Maze Bridge Development. Specifically anything about property acquisitions on Sycamore Street. The clerk looked up, a little startled. Sure. You'll need to fill out a request form. If the records aren't confidential, you can view them or get copies for a fee. Not a problem, Natalie replied smoothly, taking the form he offered. She quickly filled out the requested details. Any idea how long it'll take? If the files are on site, maybe half an hour, he said, scanning the request. Let's see. He disappeared behind a row of cabinets. Natalie waited, glancing around at the bland walls adorned with motivational posters about civic duty. She noticed a corner office with a glass window. Inside sat a man on the phone, wearing a crisp suit, his face partially obscured by Venetian blinds. She recognized him as Thomas Kimball, the same official who had appeared at Harriet's door. When Kimball spotted her, he narrowed his eyes, ended his phone call abruptly, and stood up. Natalie maintained eye contact through the blinds as he walked out of his office toward her. May I help you? He said, in the same polite monotone Harriet had described. He recognized her, or at least her family resemblance, and his features stiffened. I'm just looking at public records, she replied casually. Surely that's allowed. Kimball pursed his lips. Yes, it is, he said. But these records pertain to Maze Bridge Development, correct? Are you doing research for someone? Natalie resisted the urge to bristle at his probing. Instead, she gave a tight smile. Family reasons, she said. And yes, Maze Bridge. They seem to have an interest in my mother's property. Kimball's eyes flicked to the clerk, who was still rummaging through cabinets. I see. Well, we hope all property owners will take advantage of the city's offer if their land is scheduled for redevelopment. It's the best outcome for everyone in the long run. Natalie raised an eyebrow. That's not the opinion of many residents I've spoken to. But let's skip the rhetoric. She kept her tone civil but firm. Can you explain why the city is rushing these acquisitions? Kimball smoothed the lapel of his suit jacket. The city is operating within its legal framework. We're partnering with private sector businesses to modernize infrastructure. If certain residents prefer not to cooperate, there are legal channels. Eminent domain is rarely used, but it's an option. You might want to remember that those residents are people with lives, histories, and families, Natalie said, her voice tightening slightly. And not all of them will roll over just because you waive some official paperwork. Kimball's facade wavered. For a moment, he studied her face, as though debating whether to continue the polite charade. I trust that the process will be clear to you once you review the document, he said finally. If you have questions, you can schedule an appointment through my secretary. With that, he turned on his heel and strode back to his office. Natalie watched him leave, feeling a surge of determination. She had faced arms dealers, warlords, and corrupt bureaucrats in foreign capitals. A local official with questionable ethics was not going to intimidate her. The clerk returned, carrying 2 large folders. These are the public documents on Maysbridge's projects in the last 6 months, he said. If you need older records, let me know. Thanks, she replied, taking the folders to a nearby desk. She began scanning the pages, noting purchase prices, timelines, and the signatures authorizing each sale. She recognized the mayor's name, the head of Maysbridge Development, and others. Then she spotted a pattern. Properties on Sycamore Street had been bought up one by one at suspiciously low prices, often just days or weeks after receiving an official condemnation notice from the city. It was as if the city council and Maysbridge were working in tandem to drive residents out at a fraction of market value. As she flipped through the final pages, she came across a memo with partial redactions. The letterhead belonged to Maysbridge Development, addressed to the city's project lead. Although certain details were blacked out, there was a hint of something bigger, references to a Phase 2 involving undisclosed commercial interests. She suspected the final plan wasn't just about new apartments or shops, but possibly a lucrative corporate or governmental contract. Her mind reeled with possibilities. If Maysbridge planned to build something like a corporate headquarters or high-end resort, the profit margins could be massive. And with the city's cooperation, they stood to gain millions by obtaining land cheaply. Natalie copied what she could, snapping a few photos on her phone for later analysis. She thanked the clerk, returned the folders, and left the department, ignoring the piercing gaze she felt from Kimball's office window. Her next stop was the city council chamber, a large wood-paneled room with rows of seats for the public. She wanted to get a sense of the atmosphere. The chamber was nearly empty, just a caretaker buffing the floors. She glanced at the dais where the council members sat during hearings, picturing Harriet standing there alone, facing a panel of stern officials. The thought made her heart pound angrily. Harriet wouldn't be alone, not this time. As she turned to leave, she noticed a plaque on the wall listing current council members. 3 names in particular jumped out at her, people Harriet had mentioned in passing or in her legal notices. 1. Councilwoman Lorraine Hooper had a reputation for championing historical preservation. Another, Councilman Roger Fletcher, was rumored to be in Maysbridge's pocket. And the mayor, Harold Pierce, was at the top. She vowed to learn everything she could about them. Back outside, the morning sun had grown bright, sending shafts of light across the steps of City Hall. Natalie shielded her eyes and quickly made her way to the car. She had enough information now to confirm that this was no mere civic improvement. There was a deep well of corruption, and Harriet was caught right at the center. Natalie started the engine, feeling that familiar rush of adrenaline she'd experienced in her CIA missions. Research was the first step. Next would come infiltration, persuasion, or both. No matter the cost, she would protect her mother and end this scheme before more families lost their homes. Back at Harriet's home, Natalie found her mother in the kitchen, anxiously arranging a plate of sandwiches. "You're back," Harriet said, relief softening her features. "I was worried they might keep you tied up in red tape all day." "It almost felt that way," Natalie replied, dropping her bag on a chair. "But I got what I needed." Enough to confirm that Maysbridge and the city are definitely in cahoots. Harriet shook her head. "I can't believe they'd go to such lengths. Then again, I've seen so many of my neighbors forced out. It's heartbreaking." They took the sandwiches into the living room. Natalie spread out her phone snapshots and notes on the coffee table, explaining what she'd uncovered. Harriet nodded slowly, a determined sadness in her eyes. "So what's the plan now?" Harriet asked. "We need allies," Natalie said. "We can't do this alone. Are there any local activists, journalists, or council members who might sympathize with you?" Harriet took a moment to think. Councilwoman Lorraine Hooper. She's a retired professor from the community college, always passionate about preserving local history. And there's a local reporter, Linda Reyes, who sometimes covers stories about corruption in city projects. She interviewed me once about the historical value of Sycamore Street. Natalie jotted down the names. "I'll try to set up meetings. The best angle might be to expose the city's wrongdoing. Public pressure can be a powerful tool." They worked through lunch, Harriet occasionally chiming in with stories about the neighborhood's past, while Natalie analyzed the legal angles. As they talked, a gentle rap on the front door startled them. Harriet set down her sandwich, looking puzzled. When Harriet opened the door, there stood an elderly man in worn overalls. His face was lined with age, and he held a battered cap in trembling hands. "Mrs. Albright," he began hesitantly, "it's me, Bill Henderson. I saw your daughter's car and hoped maybe I could talk to both of you." Harriet smiled kindly. Bill Henderson had been one of the few remaining longtime residents, a man who once owned a small hardware store before retirement. "Of course, Bill. Come in." He stepped into the living room, eyes darting between Harriet and Natalie. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry to bother you," he said, voice quavering with nerves, "but I'm losing my place. The city served me notice last week. They say my home is structurally unsound, but I know it's not. I just can't afford the repairs they're demanding." Natalie motioned for him to sit. "That's part of their strategy," she said. "They find code violations or claim it's unsafe. Then they give you a bill you can't possibly pay, forcing you to accept a small buyout." Bill sank into an armchair. "I've lived there for 50 years, he murmured, voice catching. "Raised my kids. Buried my wife. Now they say I got no choice." Harriet knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Bill, we're not going to let them take everything from us without a fight." He looked up, eyes glistening. "That's all I came here to say. I heard rumors your daughter was some kind of big shot agent or something. I don't know what you can do, but maybe you can help." Natalie nodded. "I'll do what I can. We're planning to expose the city's corruption, prove they're violating the law. If we're successful, that should protect homeowners like you. But we might need your help. Public statements, maybe a collective action." Bill swallowed. "I'll do whatever it takes." Then he leaned forward, voice lowering. "I ain't much for snooping, but my granddaughter works part-time at the mayor's office. She saw something strange, files about some overseas investor. She said it looked like Maysbridge might be just a front for bigger money. I don't know the details, but it sounded fishy." Natalie's eyes sparked with interest. That could be crucial. If foreign money is involved, the city has to disclose certain details under federal law. This might be a violation of the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act or something similar. Bill looked confused. "I just wanted you to know. My granddaughter's worried about losing her job, so she won't go public. But she told me, and I figured you folks should hear it." Harriet gently patted his hand. Thank you, Bill. We'll be careful with that information. With a grateful nod, Bill rose to leave. Natalie walked him to the door, promising to stay in touch. Once he was gone, she turned to Harriet. This is bigger than we thought. Maysbridge might be a shell company. If we can prove that, the city could face federal scrutiny. They'd have to back off. Harriet exhaled. It's one thing after another. Are you sure we're safe? Natalie placed a reassuring hand on her mother's shoulder. I've dealt with worse. Trust me, we're going to be all right. Yet in her mind, Natalie knew that exposing a corrupt local deal was one thing. Challenging wealthy international investors was another matter entirely. The stakes just got higher. For Harriet's sake and for the sake of the neighborhood, Natalie would have to tread carefully. But she also felt the old familiar rush of a mission unfolding. She was determined to see it through to the end. The sun was dipping low when Natalie decided to follow up on Harriet's leads. First on the list was Councilwoman Lorraine Hooper. She was holding a small community forum at a library not far from Sycamore Street. Harriet, needing a rest, stayed behind, while Natalie drove out to meet the councilwoman in person. The library's multipurpose room had only a dozen attendees, mostly seniors. A sign near the entrance read, "Preserving Our Past, Community Discussion with Councilwoman Hooper." Natalie slipped in quietly. Lorraine Hooper was a tall, slender woman in her 60s, her hair pulled into a tidy bun. She spoke passionately about protecting historical landmarks. Her kind demeanor and earnest tone set her apart from the more callous city officials Natalie had encountered. When the forum concluded, most attendees lingered, chatting with Hooper about local heritage. Natalie waited until the crowd thinned, then approached with a polite smile. "Councilwoman Hooper," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Natalie Albright, Harriet Albright's daughter." Lorraine's eyes brightened. "Harriet's daughter. Of course. Your mother is one of the most beloved retired teachers in our district. How is she?" Worried, Natalie said, forging a direct path to the issue. "The city is trying to push her out, using eminent domain. We suspect there's more going on behind the scenes with Maysbridge development. She suggested I talk to you as someone who cares about protecting older homes." Lorraine sighed heavily, folding her arms. "I've been fighting that redevelopment plan for months. The mayor and certain council members are determined to move forward, ignoring every appeal to preserve landmarks. I'm afraid I'm outnumbered on the council." Natalie dipped her head. "Are you aware of any foreign backers behind Maysbridge?" A flicker of surprise crossed Lorraine's face. "Foreign backers? I hadn't heard that. Are you sure?" Natalie gave a cautious nod. "Not certain, but we have reason to believe it's more than just a local real estate move. If that's true, there might be regulatory or legal implications that could stall the project." Lorraine's lips pressed together thoughtfully. "If you can't provide evidence, I'd be more than willing to bring it up at the next council meeting. But we'll need something concrete." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You didn't hear this from me, but a fellow council member, Roger Fletcher, has been pushing to fast-track Maysbridge's permits. He seems unusually eager. And rumor has it he receives a healthy stream of campaign donations from out-of-state PACs." "Fletcher," Natalie repeated, recalling the name from her notes. "I suspect he's involved in more than just local politics. Would you be willing to help if I find evidence linking him or Maysbridge to foreign money?" "Absolutely," Lorraine said. "We might be a minority on the council, but if we present proof to the public, we could force an investigation." Natalie thanked her and exchanged contact information. On her way out, she felt the sense of purpose growing. The circle of corruption was tightening around a few key figures, and Councilman Fletcher seemed a prime suspect. Back in her car, she glanced at her phone. Another name Harriet had mentioned was Linda Reyes, a local journalist. Natalie found Linda's number and dialed, hoping the journalist would be open to investigating the story. Linda answered with a brisk Reyes speaking. "Hi, Linda. My name is Natalie Albright. My mother is Harriet Albright, and she told me you once interviewed her about historical preservation. Oh yes, Harriet is a lovely woman, Linda replied warmly. What can I do for you? Natalie took a breath. I'm looking into Maze Bridge Development's activities on Sycamore Street. I believe they're working with corrupt city officials to force out longtime residents, possibly even foreign investors funneling money in. Would you be interested in covering this? Linda hesitated, then said, I've heard the rumors, but no one's been able to prove anything. If you have leads or documents, I'm all ears. I can't promise my editor will run the story without solid evidence, though. Understood. I'll send you what I have, and we can meet to go over it. For now, let's keep this quiet. The city's not shy about retaliating against whistleblowers. I appreciate the caution, Linda said, her tone turning serious. Send me what you've got, and let's see if we can shine a light on this. They agreed to meet the next day. Natalie ended the call feeling the network was slowly forming. Cooper in the council, Linda in the press, Harriet's neighbors, and Harriet herself. It was a fragile alliance, but it was something. However, as Natalie started the drive back, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Usually, she would ignore such calls, but her instincts told her otherwise. She picked up. Hello. A deep male voice crackled on the other end. Ms. Albright, I presume. This is a courtesy call. How did you get this number? She asked, bracing herself. I work with individuals who are very interested in the development plans in your town, the voice continued, ignoring her question. We suggest you keep your nose out of business that doesn't concern you. Natalie's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Threatening a former CIA operative is a bad idea, she said, letting her tone sharpen. A low chuckle came through the line. Your credentials don't scare us. This isn't a war zone. It's a simple real estate matter. We can settle it amicably if you cooperate. Take the city's buyout for your mother's property and move on. Natalie's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. I don't respond well to threats. Goodbye. She ended the call, her mind already racing with questions. How had they gotten her number so quickly? Probably from an ally in the city's government. Kimball, Fletcher, someone was feeding them information. One thing was certain, these weren't just local bullies. They had resources and connections, and they were watching her closely. A stab of worry shot through Natalie as she pictured Harriet at home. Could they be desperate enough to intimidate or harm a 90-year-old woman? No, she wouldn't allow it. Natalie pressed the gas pedal a little harder, anxious to get back to Sycamore Street. In her CIA career, she'd learned that unwavering vigilance was the difference between safety and disaster. Now she would have to bring all her skills to bear in defense of her mother and of a neighborhood on the brink of losing its soul. By the time Natalie reached Harriet's house, dusk had settled, painting the Victorian's facade in soft shadows and warm lamplight. She locked her car carefully, scanning the street for any suspicious vehicles. Her paranoia might be overkill, but old habits died hard, especially after that threatening call. Inside, Harriet was dozing in her armchair, crocheted blanket across her lap. The television was on low volume, broadcasting a news segment about a local pet adoption drive. Natalie gently roused her mother, who stirred with a small smile. You're back, Harriet murmured, sitting up. I must have drifted off. It's been a long day. Natalie knelt beside her, tucking the blanket around Harriet's legs. Did anything unusual happen while I was gone? Any visitors or calls? Harriet's eyes flickered with concern. No, nothing. Why? Is everything all right? Natalie hesitated, debating how much to reveal. She decided Harriet deserved honesty. I got a call from someone who didn't want me digging into Maysbridge. It was a threat, basically. They want us to give up. A tremor of fear passed over Harriet's face, but it quickly hardened into resolve. Well, that only means we're on to something they're afraid of. Natalie managed a small smile, relieved to see Harriet's spirit unbroken. Precisely. But it also means we need to be cautious. She paused, glancing around the living room. Mom, we might have to consider some security measures. Just in case. Harriet nodded. Understand. Whatever you think is best. They spent the next hour discussing practical steps. Natalie checked all the locks, examined the windows, and decided to install a few low-profile security cameras around the exterior. She had brought some spy tech from her consulting work, motion sensors that could be discreetly placed by doors and windows. After securing the house as best they could, Natalie joined Harriet at the kitchen table, where they heated up leftover soup. The warm meal was a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere. Harriet broke the silence, her voice uncertain. Natalie, are we in danger? Natalie paused. I won't lie to you, there's some risk. But I've dealt with worse. If they realize we won't scare easily, they might back down. Bullies often do. Harriet took a careful sip of soup. I never wanted you to be pulled back into this kind of life. Looking over your shoulder, dealing with threats. Natalie reached across the table and gripped her mother's hand. I'm doing this because I love you, Mom. And because you deserve to keep the home you've built your life around. Tears rimmed Harriet's eyes. She squeezed Natalie's hand back, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, darling. They finished their meal, cleaned the dishes, and retreated to the living room again. Natalie spread out the files she collected, determined to decode as much as possible, while Harriet quietly knitted, a calming activity she had carried through decades of teaching. Natalie scanned through more land acquisition records, cross-referencing them with a partial memo about Phase 2. Her CIA training and pattern recognition kicked into gear. She noticed that each property was located along a soon-to-be expanded roadway, which might connect to a larger highway system. That highway expansion, in turn, could accommodate heavier commercial traffic, perfect for a massive industrial or commercial development. Then she came across an article from 6 months prior mentioning a foreign trade delegation visiting the mayor's office. The delegation was from an East Asian country, but the name of the corporation they represented was absent. Could Maysbridge be connected to that delegation? She quickly pulled up her secure laptop using a few public intelligence resources she still had access to. Searching the name Maysbridge Development led her to a labyrinth of shell companies registered in multiple states. Finally, she found a lead. An entity named Cheong International was listed as a major investor in one of those shell companies. Cheong International, in turn, was known to invest heavily in real estate in North America under various aliases. A big part of Cheong's portfolio included technology parks and data centers, facilities that required significant land parcels and strong infrastructure connections. Natalie chewed on her lip. If Cheong wanted to build a data center or tech campus on Sycamore Street, they'd stand to profit massively if they got the land cheap. And local politicians would get a windfall of bribes and revenue. Harriet looked up from her knitting. Find anything. Natalie closed her laptop, frowning in thought. If I'm right, a foreign conglomerate wants this neighborhood for a big tech project, something that could be worth hundreds of millions. They're using Maysbridge as a front, so it looks like a local development plan. That way, they can bypass some regulations and keep everything hush-hush until the deal's done. Harriet set her knitting needles aside. So that's why they're so desperate. If one homeowner refuses to sell, they can't assemble the land they need. Exactly. The city can't finalize the deal without controlling every parcel. And the synergy between the local government and foreign capital can be a magnet for corruption. Harriet's brow creased with worry. How do we expose it? Natalie glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight, but her adrenaline kept her alert. I've got a meeting with a reporter tomorrow. I'll share what I have. But the public might need more than speculation. We need hard evidence of a direct link, like contract or a wire transfer. That's tricky to get. She recalled Bill Henderson's comment about his granddaughter working at the mayor's office. Could she access relevant files? But that would risk her job or worse. Still, if she could be persuaded to leak something crucial, it might be the breakthrough they needed. For now, the best course was to rest, gather strength, and proceed strategically. Harriet patted Natalie's hand, as if sensing her inner turmoil. "Come on, darling," Harriet said softly. "It's late. Let's get some sleep." Natalie nodded, though her mind still buzzed with calculations and contingency plans. She helped Harriet up the stairs, making sure her mother was safely in bed before heading to her own room, her old childhood bedroom, still adorned with posters of constellations on the ceiling. She lay down, staring at the faint glow of the stars she once dreamed beneath as a girl. Now, those dreams felt overshadowed by the looming threat outside. She allowed herself a brief moment of vulnerability before steeling her resolve once more. They wanted a fight. She would give them one. In the quiet hours past midnight, a car idled at the far end of Sycamore Street. Two figures sat in the vehicle, their forms obscured by darkness, the faint glow of a laptop screen reflecting off the driver's face. "She's the passenger said in a low voice. "This is risky." The driver let out a grunt. "We have our orders. Keep an eye on her, intimidate if necessary. We're being paid well." A tense silence followed, punctuated only by the hum of the engine. Finally, the driver put the car in gear. The headlights remained off as they slowly cruised past Harriet Albright's Victorian home. A digital camera clicked, capturing images of the house. Then the car sped away into the night, vanishing before it reached the next intersection. Inside the Victorian, Natalie stirred in her sleep. A passing nightmare, or some flicker of her well-honed instincts telling her she was being watched. She shifted, her dreams dark and jumbled, filled with faceless threats. The morning arrived with an eerie calm, the storm of conflict still looming. Natalie woke early, scanning the house with a practiced vigilance. She found Harriet already dressed, sitting by the window with a cup of tea and her Bible open on her lap. Harriet wasn't an overly religious person, but reading scripture often calmed her mind. "Everything all right?" Harriet asked softly, seeing her daughter's tense posture. Natalie forced a reassuring smile. "Yes, Mom. Just being cautious." She debated whether to tell Harriet she suspected they were being watched last night, deciding to keep it to herself for now. Over breakfast, Natalie went over her plan for the day. Meet with Linda Reyes, the journalist, and hand over the preliminary evidence. Reach out to Bill Henderson about his granddaughter's potential help in finding documents at the mayor's office. Follow up with Councilwoman Hooper regarding the next council meeting. Harriet nodded, though worry lingered in her eyes. "What can I do?" "You can keep being the courageous teacher you've always been," Natalie said with a warm laugh. "But seriously, if you're up for it, maybe you can start organizing the neighbors, anyone who's willing to stand up at the hearing next month." Harriet's gaze flickered with renewed purpose. "I can do that. I still have a phone tree for a few folks. We used it for community events. Maybe we can rally some support." They embraced briefly before Natalie headed out, carefully scanning the street for any suspicious vehicles. None stood out. She drove off, first to the local newspaper's building, a modest 3-story structure on Main Street. Linda Reyes greeted her in a cluttered office, the walls lined with pinned-up articles and sticky notes. "Thanks for coming," the journalist said, shaking Natalie's hand. "Let's see what you've got." They spent an hour poring over the Maysbridge documents, the partially redacted memo, and the circumstantial evidence linking the project to foreign investment. Linda's eyebrows rose at several points, particularly when Natalie mentioned Cheong International. "I've heard of Cheong," Linda said, flipping through her notes. "They're notorious for setting up shell companies to buy land for data centers or manufacturing plants. But they keep a low profile. If they're really behind Maysbridge, that's a big story." Natalie nodded. "We need something conclusive. If we could get a direct link, like an email from the mayor referencing Cheong, or a contract with Cheong's signature, it would blow this wide open." Linda leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her chin. "I can start digging through city records online, maybe file a Freedom of Information Act request. But those can take time, and city officials can slow walk them." "I might have another avenue," Natalie said. "A contact in the mayor's office. But it's risky." Use your discretion, Linda said carefully. I don't want anyone losing their job or risking their safety. But if they are willing, it could be our best bet. They agreed to coordinate their findings and stay in close communication. Linda promised to keep the story under wraps until they had the smoking gun. Next, Natalie drove to Bill Henderson's modest bungalow. A pile of newspapers sat on the porch, and Bill answered the door with a cautious smile. "Morning, Ms. Albright," he said, stepping aside so she could enter. Inside, the living room was cluttered with old photos and souvenirs. "My granddaughter Jessica will be here soon," Bill said. "She's on her lunch break." They waited in a silence tinged with anxiety until the front door squeaked open. A young woman in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail, entered. She froze momentarily at the sight of Natalie, as though uncertain she could trust her. Bill motioned her over. "Jess, this is the lady I told you about. Harriet Albright's daughter." Jessica nodded politely. "I remember Mrs. Albright from when I was a kid," she said. "She taught my cousins. Always so nice." Natalie offered a reassuring smile. "Your grandfather said you might have seen some documents or overheard something at the mayor's office?" Jessica wrung her hands nervously. "I'm just a receptionist, an intern, really. I don't have clearance for big secrets, but I pick up stuff. There's a lot of talk about a big investor from Asia. The mayor's chief of staff basically said we need to get rid of every property on Sycamore. No questions asked. He told one of the aides that a holdout could ruin the deal." Natalie nodded, encouraging Jessica to continue. Jessica glanced at her grandfather, then back at Natalie. "I did see a folder labeled Cheong contract on his desk once. The mayor's office is usually careful about that stuff, but I guess he left it out by accident. I couldn't see much, just the name. If that folder is still around, it might be the smoking gun you're looking for." Natalie's pulse quickened. "That's exactly what we need. But how could we get a copy?" Jessica paled slightly. "They keep a locked file cabinet in the mayor's personal office. The chief of staff has the key. I know the combination to the cabinet area, but there's a second lock on the actual drawer." Natalie resisted the impulse to grin like an operative on the brink of a breakthrough. "Jessica, do you think you could get me in there after hours? Or at least distract whoever's in charge long enough for me to find that folder?" Bill's eyes widened. "You want my granddaughter to break in?" Natalie held up a calming hand. "Nothing so overt. More like a quiet look around. No forced entry, no stolen keys, nothing illegal if possible. But we need that folder if we're going to stop them from evicting your neighbors." Jessica swallowed hard. "I'm scared, but I don't want them to take Grandpa's house. Or Mrs. Albright's. If we can do it without me getting fired or arrested, I'll try." Natalie nodded appreciatively. "I'll handle the risk. Just get me into the building, distract the staff, and I'll do the rest. Once we have those documents, we'll have the leverage we need." They hashed out a plan. Jessica would stay late on a day the mayor left early for a meeting. She'd text Natalie when the coast was clear. Natalie would then come in posing as a courier or maybe an IT specialist, whatever ruse worked best. With a little luck and her CIA-honed skills, she could pick the file cabinet lock quickly. Jessica left soon after to head back to work, looking both anxious and determined. Bill walked her to the door, then returned to Natalie with a worried expression. "Please keep her safe," he whispered. Natalie placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "I promise. We'll be careful." As she headed back to Harriet's house, Natalie felt a mixture of excitement and dread. She was crossing a line, treading into territory that mirrored her old CIA days. But for Harriet, for Bill, for the entire community that had been threatened and ignored, she would do it without hesitation. The truth was on their side. They just had to expose it. Before the covert operation at the mayor's office could take place, a new event shook the community. Councilwoman Hooper announced an emergency public meeting on historic preservation, scheduled for the following evening. It was a surprising move. Such meetings usually required more notice. But Natalie suspected Hooper was trying to create public momentum before the city could push through any last-minute deals. Harriet, determined to rally neighbors, spent the day on the phone, calling everyone she knew. She persuaded them to attend the meeting, offering rides to those who struggled with mobility. By late afternoon, Harriet's Victorian hummed with activity as neighbors stopped by for informational flyers or just to lend support. Bill Henderson arrived with a few other longtime residents, each bearing stories of intimidation and fear tactics from the city. Natalie circulated among them, collecting their testimonies. She planned to send a summary to Linda Reyes, who might run a preliminary article highlighting the human cost of Maysbridge scheme. Every news story added weight to their cause. As evening fell, Harriet tapped a spoon against a glass to get everyone's attention. "I can't thank you all enough for standing together," she began, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "This isn't just about one house. It's about preserving our history and our rights as citizens of this community." An appreciative murmur followed. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. Others nodded in firm agreement. Natalie stood by her mother, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. After the small gathering dispersed, Harriet turned to Natalie with a soft smile. "I never imagined our home will become a sort of headquarters for resistance. It's exhausting, but in a way, it's also invigorating." Natalie smoothed back a stray strand of Harriet's silver hair. "You're a born leader, Mom. You've always been." A knock on the front door interrupted them. Natalie's eyes flicked to Harriet in concern. They weren't expecting more visitors. She moved cautiously to answer. On the porch stood Thomas Kimball, the city official who had first delivered the eviction notice. He wore the same tailored suit, though a trace of nervousness flickered in his eyes. "May I come in?" he asked. Natalie stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her. She didn't want Harriet involved in another tense confrontation if she could help it. "What do you want?" she asked coolly. Kimball held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Look, I might have been too forceful before. I wanted to see if we could settle this amicably." She crossed her arms. "Amicably? You've served eviction notices, threatened my mother with legal action, and you expect me to believe you suddenly want peace?" Kimball exhaled. "I'm just a messenger. The city's official stance hasn't changed, but off the record, I think you're making a mistake by resisting. This development is a done deal. If you keep pushing, you'll face a lot of grief." Natalie studied him for a moment. She sensed a sliver of sincerity, perhaps even regret. "Why are you telling me this?" He glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Because I see the bigger picture now. Councilman Fletcher and the mayor, they have more invested in this than just local development. They won't hesitate to crush anyone in their way. If you keep digging, you'll make enemies with very deep pockets. I don't want to see a bloodbath." Natalie's jaw tightened. "So you're not here to help us, you're here to warn us off?" Kimball looked genuinely pained. "That's the best I can do without losing my job. Believe me, Ms. Albright, I'm caught in the middle. I just wanted to warn you that tomorrow's meeting might be a powder keg." She let out a harsh laugh. "We've faced threats already. We're not backing down." Kimball lowered his voice. "Then be careful," he said, stepping away. Without waiting for a response, he descended the porch steps and disappeared into the night. Natalie stood there for a moment, the cool evening air washing over her. She sensed Kimball's warning was genuine. Fletcher and the mayor were playing for keeps, but fear had never dissuaded her before. She went back inside, resolved to prepare for the next day's public confrontation. Harriet stood by the window, her face etched with concern. "Was that who I think it was?" Natalie nodded. "Yes, but don't worry. He was just issuing a warning. Tomorrow will be pivotal." Harriet's lips thinned into a determined line. "Then we'll face them head on." Natalie hugged her mother gently, a silent promise passing between them. Tomorrow's meeting would be their chance to spark a public outcry and hopefully turn the tide. The community auditorium was packed the following evening, standing room only. The air crackled with anticipation as residents gathered, many holding signs that read "Save Our Homes" or "Historic Sycamore," not corporate greed. Councilwoman Hooper stood at a podium at the front of the room, flanked by two aides who struggled to maintain order. Mayor Harold Pierce was notably absent. In his stead stood Councilman Roger Fletcher, arms crossed, projecting an air of authority. Natalie stood with Harriet near the front row, flanked by Bill Henderson and several other neighbors. On the stage, local historians and preservationists waited to speak. Lorraine Hooper tapped the microphone, her voice echoing through the auditorium speakers. "Thank you all for coming. We called this emergency meeting because time is running out for many of our historic neighborhoods. We must address the city's plan to redevelop Sycamore Street and other locations." A loud murmur ran through the crowd. Fletcher stepped forward. "With all due respect, Councilwoman Hooper, this is not the forum to debate city policy. That belongs in official council sessions." Lorraine's eyes flashed. "This is about hearing from the citizens who will be most affected. They have the right to be heard in a public space, not just in a sanitized council chamber where they're given 2 minutes at the microphone and then dismissed." Cheers erupted. Harriet took a shaky breath, then raised her hand. Hooper nodded in her direction, signaling for Harriet to approach the microphone. Natalie steadied Harriet as she climbed the short steps to the stage. A hush fell over the crowd when Harriet began speaking. "My name is Harriet Albright," she said, voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with each word. "I've lived on Sycamore Street for more than 70 years. I taught in the city's high schools for 4 decades. I've seen generations grow up, go to college, and come back to serve this community." Some applause broke out, and Harriet paused, tears glistening in her eyes. "Now, the city I've loved my entire life wants to take my home from me. They call it progress, but I call it cruelty. Where is the moral compass that guides us to protect the vulnerable? Or respect our elders? Or honor our history?" A wave of emotion moved through the crowd. Harriet's sincerity touched hearts. Even Fletcher seemed momentarily flustered. Then Harriet turned to him, voice sharper. "Councilman Fletcher, can you look me in the eye and tell me this is truly for the greater good?" Fletcher cleared his throat, stepping to the microphone. "Mrs. Albright, we appreciate your service and dedication to this community. But progress requires sacrifice. The city has limited real estate, and we must expand to accommodate future generations." A chorus of boos erupted. Harriet remained composed. "Then why do these new developments cater to luxury apartments that most locals can't afford? Why is the city ignoring affordable housing options in favor of corporate expansions?" Fletcher's face darkened. "We're following the law. Eminent domain is a legal tool. We offer fair compensation, often above market value." Loud jeers rang out at that statement, as many residents claimed to have been offered far below market value. Shouts of lies and corruption filled the air. Lorraine Hooper quickly regained control, banging a gavel on the podium. "Let's remain orderly. Are there any further statements?" Natalie gripped Harriet's hand, meeting her mother's gaze. Harriet gave a subtle nod. Stepping forward, Natalie raised her voice so it carried through the auditorium. "My name is Natalie Albright, Harriet's daughter. I've been researching Maysbridge development and found evidence suggesting they're backed by foreign investors who are using shell companies to acquire land at fire sale prices. They're colluding with city officials to force out residents. This isn't about building better neighborhoods. It's about profits at any cost." Gasps and murmurs spread through the room. Fletcher visibly stiffened, glaring at Natalie. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Albright. I trust you have proof." Natalie stared him down. "I'm working on it. And when I have it, the entire city will see just how deep the corruption runs." Fletcher forced a laugh. "Conspiracy theories have no place in civic discourse. Maysbridge is a legitimate development firm. The city is simply doing its duty. Natalie didn't break eye contact. Then you won't mind if the public demands a full, independent investigation, including a forensic audit of all Maysbridge transactions? Fletcher's mouth tightened. These matters are best handled by the proper authorities, not in a public forum stirred up by emotional pleas. Another swell of discontent rose from the crowd. Lorraine Hooper tried to restore order again. We appreciate everyone's input. Clearly, tensions are high, and we need transparency. I propose a formal motion to pause all eminent domain actions pending an independent review of Maysbridge's finances. A roar of approval came from the audience. Fletcher scowled. You'll need a majority vote in the council for that, which you don't have. Harriet leaned into the microphone one last time. We still believe in democracy, councilman. We will make our voices heard until those who represent us do what is right. Cheers resounded through the auditorium, drowning out any retort Fletcher might have. The meeting wrapped soon after, with residents spilling out into the lobby, forming impromptu committees and sharing contact information. Natalie caught fleeting glimpses of Fletcher and a couple of the mayor's aides slipping out a side exit, their faces grim. Outside, the night air felt charged with energy. Harriet stood near the entrance, greeted by neighbors who hugged or patted her on the back, thanking her for speaking out. Natalie guided her mother through the crowd toward their car. That was brave, Natalie said, unlocking the door. Are you all right? Harriet smiled, looking surprisingly invigorated. I'm more than all right. I finally spoke my piece in front of them. Let's hope it makes a difference. Natalie nodded. I'll contact Linda Reyes. That meeting was a spectacle, perfect for public attention. Now we just need that final piece of evidence. As they drove away, Harriet gazed out the window at the familiar streets. No matter what happens, I'm proud of our community for standing up. Natalie reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. We're in this together, Mom. One way or another, we'll get to the truth. Yet amid the victorious afterglow, Natalie's instincts remained on high alert. Fletcher and whoever else was behind Maysbridge wouldn't go down without a fight. And the next battle might not be fought in a public forum, but in the shadows. 2 nights after the public meeting, Jessica sent Natalie a terse text. Mayor leaving early. Office mostly empty after 7 p.m. Natalie had prepared carefully, dressing in an understated outfit, a navy blazer, black slacks, and flat shoes for mobility. She carried a slim bag containing a lockpicking set, a small flashlight, and her phone. If all went well, she'd be in and out within minutes. She parked near a side entrance to City Hall, out of range of security cameras she'd spotted on previous reconnaissance. Jessica met her at the door, eyes wide with nerves. I told the security guard a computer tech was coming to do a software update, Jessica whispered. I said the system crashed earlier. He didn't question it much. Natalie nodded. Good work. Where's the chief of staff? Went home. Only the night janitor and the security guard are left on this floor. Jessica led the way down a corridor lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. They passed a half-open door to an unoccupied conference room, its overhead lamp casting flickering shadows. At the end of the corridor stood the door to the mayor's personal office. Jessica fished out a key card and swiped it over the electronic reader. The door clicked open. His desk is to the right, and the locked cabinet is behind it, Jessica explained. I can keep watch if you want. Yes, please, Natalie said, stepping inside. Let me know if anyone comes. Jessica nodded, easing the door shut behind Natalie. The office smelled faintly of stale coffee and cologne. Heavy drapes covered the windows, and polished wood dominated the decor, a testament to the mayor's preference for an imposing atmosphere. Natalie's gaze swept the room, quickly finding the file cabinet Jessica had mentioned. She knelt by the cabinet. A digital keypad glowed faintly. She exhaled, remembering a similar lock system she'd bypassed on a mission years ago in Eastern Europe. The mayor must have splurged on a fancy security measure, but nothing was foolproof. From her bag, Natalie pulled out a small device that could interface with the keypad wiring. She carefully removed the keypad's casing, exposing a circuit board. Her hands moved with practiced precision, connecting the device to the board and initiating a brute force algorithm. Each beep from the device felt like a thunderclap in the silence. A faint click signaled success. She removed the device, replaced the casing, and pulled the drawer open. Inside were several manila folders, each labeled with coded abbreviations. She scanned them quickly until she found the one labeled Cheong contract. Her heart pounded as she flipped it open. The top sheet was a memorandum of understanding, referencing a multi-phase development plan for a technology hub. The signatures at the bottom included Maysbridge Development CEO and a representative from Cheong International. And there, in stark black ink, was the mayor's signature as a witness, with Councilman Fletcher's name listed as a community liaison. Jackpot. She snapped a series of photos with her phone, turning each page carefully. The next documents were more detailed, proposed timelines, cost breakdowns, and evidence that Cheong had already sent millions in funds to a local bank account controlled by City Partnerships LLC, an entity that likely funneled bribes to officials. This was indisputable proof of collusion and foreign investment secretly shaping local policy. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Natalie froze. Through the door, she heard Jessica's voice, strained but calm, talking to someone. She hurried to finish photographing the last pages. Then she placed the folder back exactly as she'd found it, gently sliding the drawer shut. The door opened, and Jessica rushed in, eyes wide. "Security guard is coming this way. We need to go." Natalie rose, heart thudding, but forced herself to stay composed. She pocketed her phone, ensuring the screen was off. "Let's do it." They stepped out into the hallway, walking quickly, but not running, trying to look like they belonged. The security guard appeared around the corner, a tall man in a rumpled uniform. He gave them a quizzical look. "All done?" he asked, suspicion tinging his tone. Jessica nodded. "Yep, the IT fix is done. System's back online. Mr. Walton will be happy tomorrow." The guard grunted. "I didn't see you enter his office, though." She shrugged with faux confidence. "We had to check the router in the back room first. Then the main system in the office. Sorry if we didn't notify you right away." He seemed to accept the explanation, though not entirely pleased. "You heading out now?" "Yes," Natalie answered with a polite nod, trying to look unremarkable. "Thanks for staying on top of security. We'll be on our way." He gave them one more searching glance, then resumed his patrol. Jessica and Natalie hurried to the side exit, breathing sighs of relief once they were safely outside. Jessica's face was flushed with adrenaline. "Oh my God, we did it." Natalie gripped her shoulder. "Thank you. That was brave. Now get home safely. No one has to know you were involved." Jessica nodded, tears of relief welling in her eyes. Then she hurried off to her car. Natalie watched her go, gratitude and guilt swirling within her. She hated dragging a civilian into covert activities, but sometimes exposing the truth required moral gray areas. With the contract photos in her possession, Natalie felt a weight lift. They finally had the smoking gun. She climbed into her own car, carefully backing out of the parking lot. Soon, the city's entire scheme would be laid bare. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. The next morning, Harriet woke to find Natalie in the living room, laptop open, scanning through the photos of the Cheong contract. The early light spilled across Natalie's face, highlighting the triumphant yet anxious set of her jaw. "We have them," Natalie murmured, almost in disbelief. "It's all here. Proof that Maysbridge is just a shell for Cheong, the mayor's signatures, Fletcher's involvement. There's no way they can claim ignorance now." Harriet approached, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Thank God. What's our next move?" Natalie clicked her tongue thoughtfully. "We go public. I'll send copies to Linda Reyes, Councilwoman Hooper, maybe even a federal agency if necessary. Once the public learns of this massive deception, buying land for a foreign corporation without disclosure, there should be an outcry. The city council will have no choice but to halt everything. Harriet exhaled with relief. I'd like to live out my days in peace in my own home. Natalie smiled, clasping her mother's hand. You will. They spent the morning preparing. Linda Reyes was thrilled, promising an explosive article. Councilwoman Hooper arranged a press conference outside City Hall, where residents could demand immediate action. By noon, people gathered in a throng on the City Hall steps, holding signs and chanting slogans. Camera crews arrived, drawn by Linda's tip about major revelations. Harriet, Bill, and other neighbors stood near the front, while Natalie remained at Harriet's side, ready to present the evidence. Lorraine Hooper stepped up to a makeshift podium. Today we bring forth grave concerns about the city's redevelopment plan, she announced, her voice amplified by a small speaker. We have discovered that Maysbridge Development is fronting for a foreign entity, Cheong International, in a deal that was never disclosed to the public. And it appears certain officials have conspired to evict residents under false pretenses. A rumble of outrage passed through the crowd. Fletcher and Mayor Pierce emerged from City Hall, flanked by aides, all wearing stern expressions. Mayor Pierce raised his hands, calling for silence. Councilwoman Hooper, you're making serious accusations. Do you have proof? That's what this press conference is for, Hooper replied, beckoning Natalie. Ms. Albright, please share your findings. Natalie, heart pounding, stepped to the microphone. She held up a folder containing printed copies of the contract photos. My investigation revealed a direct link between Maysbridge and Cheong International. This contract, signed by the mayor and witnessed by Councilman Fletcher, shows the plan for a technology complex right where our historic homes stand. In return, Cheong Shell Company paid millions in consulting fees to a local LLC connected to city officials. Mayor Pierce's face paled. Fletcher bristled angrily. This is outrageous. That contract must be fabricated. You have no right to break into private files. A barrage of reporters yelled questions, cameras clicking furiously. Natalie raised her voice to be heard. We have more copies. They've been sent to reputable journalists and law enforcement. The city is obligated to disclose any foreign partnership of this magnitude. Hiding it violates multiple regulations. Fletcher pointed an accusing finger. You're meddling in matters you don't understand. Eminent domain is legal. As for foreign investment, cities partner with overseas companies all the time to boost the economy. Lorraine Hooper stepped between them, but not in secret. Not without public hearings or transparency. You both signed documents forging this deal behind the public's back, and you threatened to use eminent domain illegally to bulldoze people's homes. The crowd erupted in shouts. Harriet, standing with Bill and other neighbors, spoke up. We will not be silenced or intimidated. This is our community, our lives. Sensing the tide turning, local TV anchors aimed microphones at Harriet. She repeated her story of 70 years on Sycamore Street, of intimidation from city officials, and of the heartbreak of watching her neighbors forced out. Mayor Pierce tried to regain control, adopting a conciliatory tone. Mrs. Albright, no one wants to see you suffer. The city is. You can spare me the platitudes, Harriet interrupted, her teacher's voice carrying across the crowd. We have your signature, Mr. Mayor. You sold us out. Applause and cheers drowned out any further protest from Pierce. Councilwoman Hooper seized the moment, calling for an independent investigation by the state attorney general. She promised to file an emergency motion to halt all eminent domain actions and have an outside agency review the Cheong contract. At that point, Fletcher and the mayor retreated inside, their political careers hanging by a thread. The crowd roared with triumphant chants, and TV cameras captured every second. Natalie felt a surge of relief so profound it nearly made her dizzy. She turned and pulled Harriet into a hug. You did it, Mom, Natalie whispered. Your courage helped bring everything into the light. Harriet pulled back, tears shining. No, we did it together. Neighbors crowded around them, some weeping with joy, others shouting thanks and congratulations. Linda Reyes grabbed Natalie's arm. This story is going to shake the city to its core, she said. I'll have it online by this evening and in print tomorrow. Councilwoman Hooper joined them. I don't know if the mayor and Fletcher will resign or if we'll have to force them out, but we've won a major victory today. Thank you, Ms. Albright. Natalie deflected the praise modestly, just doing what needed to be done. In a swirl of excitement, Harriet and Natalie finally stepped away, seeking a moment of quiet. They found a bench near a small flower garden in front of City Hall, where they could watch the crowd from a distance. Harriet exhaled, leaning her head against Natalie's shoulder. I'm so proud of you, darling. You never hesitated to protect me or any of us. Natalie placed an arm around her mother, gazing at the city she'd grown up in, now on the brink of much-needed reform. I'm just happy you'll get to stay in your house, Mom. That's where you belong. They stayed there for a while, letting the cheers and camera flashes wash over them. The sun was warm on their faces. A new chapter was beginning for Sycamore Street. And for Harriet and Natalie, it was a reaffirmation of a bond forged through love, challenged by distance, but ultimately unbreakable. 2 months later, Harriet sat on her porch swing, admiring the summer flowers blooming in her front yard. Birds chirped in the old oak tree, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. A headline on the local paper resting beside her read, Mayor resigns, councilman indicted in redevelopment scandal. Thanks to the avalanche of public outcry, the city council had scrapped the Maysbridge plan entirely, placing a moratorium on eminent domain for private development. Investigations revealed that Pierce and Fletcher had secretly funneled money from Cheong to their own PACs in return for pushing the Technology Hub project. Both faced legal consequences, their reputations destroyed. Natalie stepped out onto the porch, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea. It's a beautiful day, she remarked, handing 1 cup to Harriet. Harriet sipped thoughtfully. I can't believe we're finally at peace. No more knocks on the door from city officials trying to take my home. Natalie smiled. And the neighborhood is rallying to renovate some of these older houses. That's real progress. People working together to restore what we have instead of tearing it down. A comfortable silence passed between them. Harriet watched a squirrel scamper across the lawn, recalling fond memories of how her husband used to chase them away from the bird feeder. Though he was gone, and though many old friends had moved or passed on, Harriet felt a renewed sense of belonging. She had faced down corruption, with her daughter at her side, and emerged victorious. Harriet patted Natalie's hand. So she said, "What's next for you, my fearless CA daughter?" Natalie laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. "I'm not sure, but I think I'll stay close by for a while. Maybe I can help Councilwoman Hooper with some real community improvements, ones that actually benefit the people. Or maybe I'll just rest for once." Harriet smiled, her gaze drifting to the old Victorian sturdy walls. "You always have a home here. It's big enough for the both of us, you know." Natalie paused, emotion catching in her throat. "I'd like that, Mom. I really would." They settled into a companionable silence, sipping tea, letting the soft creak of the porch swing and the gentle hum of the neighborhood lull them into contentment. A few houses down, Bill Henderson was painting his shutters, waving at them as they passed. Across the street, neighbors chatted on their front steps. Sycamore Street was alive and well, its heart beating strong, no longer threatened by bulldozers and shadowy deals. For a moment, Harriet thought of all the students she'd taught, all the lessons on courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. She realized this had been her greatest lesson of all, one lived, not just taught. And in that lesson, both she and her daughter found a renewed faith in the community and in each other. The sun continued its slow journey across the sky, casting warm light over the house that Harriet called home, now safe and protected, a testament to the enduring strength of a mother's love and a daughter's unwavering resolve.